Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us online for the launch of the 2021 NCAS Findings for young people. It's wonderful to have had so many registrations and so many of you join us today, given the difficult time of year and how busy everyone is. So thank you very much for attending. My name is Sam Mostyn and I have the great privilege of chairing ANROS. I chair the board of ANROS and have done for a number of years. And today I'm helping to MC the event with a few introductory remarks before we get to our guest speakers and an explanation of the report itself. I'm conscious that Dr. Jane Lloyd, who has been the acting CEO of ANROS, has been an instrumental part of managing ANROS on the departure of our former CEO, Padma Raman, to lead the Office for Women, and that we've recently announced that Dr. Tessa Boyd-Cain will be taking on the role as CEO of ANROS in February next year, and I'm really delighted that we've been able to attract Tessa to lead ANROS at this important time, and I thought you'd all want to know about that if you hadn't already heard about that appointment. Of course, I'd like to start today by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that you are joining from all over this beautiful country as our presenters, and I extend that acknowledgement to wherever you are joining from and from wherever our speakers are today. So before I get into the introduction of the event itself, just want to let you know that if you have a look at the screens, I think we're putting up right now a couple of QR codes. One of the codes is for you to download the report itself, so you can access the findings for Young Australians report in the first QR code. The second QR code is for you to be able to access everything today with closed captions. So hopefully you're able to download those QR codes and access the material. And note that we are recording today. So if you're aware of people who couldn't make it, or you'd like to ensure that others get to hear this half hour of summary, please do ensure that everyone knows that we are recording today. So to the body of the work today that we're exploring, we're talking about attitudes towards gender equality and violence against women. We know that holding prejudicial attitudes towards people based on other attributes such as ethnicity, Aboriginality, sexual preference or disability is also a predictor of attitudes that are supportive of violence against women. That is, these forms of prejudice and discrimination are inextricably linked. So today, while we're focusing on the gender piece, this is just one part of a very complex picture that can't be addressed through taking a single focus, and has been at the heart of the work of ANROS, and I'm sure many of you in the sector who are joining us today. So we do look forward to working with you across 2024 to further unpack all of these findings and interrogate them and consider what lies ahead in response to the findings of attitudes. I'm sure many of you do know, but I'll just very quickly remind you that ANROS is an independent, not-for-profit company that was established as an initiative under Australia's National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children, 2010 to 2022. We're embedded in the National Plan architecture, and we continue to hold and build the evidence base that we hope supports the ending of violence against women and children in Australia under the National Plan. And we have a unique mission at ANROS, and that is to mobilise this evidence, to communicate the evidence and work in collaboration with the very wide network of people who are invested in ending violence against women and children. And we want to support everyone on the call today and all of your colleagues and networks in ensuring that we help you develop and implement the evidence base for evidence-informed practice and policy, of which this report is a very significant component. Today is a milestone for us in the ongoing analysis of the results from the 2021 National Community Attitude Survey. I'll call it NCAST to save some words, but these are measures that really do tell us so much about the Australian community's attitudes and understanding regarding violence against women, their attitudes towards gender inequality in particular, and their intentions to intervene when witnessing violence or disrespect against women. And I note that we'll come to introduce the Minister in a moment, but I think we're lucky enough to know that I think in the mid-year economic document that will be released by the Treasurer and the Minister for Finance today, and in her role also as Minister for Women, there'll be some acknowledgement of specific provisions that deal with the plan and issues facing women escaping violence. So it's wonderful once again to see that this is a continuing commitment of the current federal government in collaboration with other governments, but it continues to attract very strong support. And so do look out for, I guess, the MyEFO statements later today. Now, NCAS is the world's longest running survey of community attitudes towards violence against women, and many of you are very familiar with our survey work, and it's hard not to be gripped by just a couple of statistics. 41% of respondents to the 2021 survey believe, mistakenly, but believe quite deeply, that domestic violence is equally committed by men and women. And although 91% of our respondents believe violence against women is a problem in Australia, only 47% believe it's a problem in their own suburb or town. So there's a pushing it away to it's someone else's problem, not my community's problem, not my family's problem. So the question that comes from all of the work that we do in this work is to really ask the question, as we take evidence to action, is what do we do with these kinds of statistics? Attitudes and understanding play a role in shaping social norms. And so we believe that the NCAS is a gauge for how Australia is progressing and changing the broader climate that facilitates a culture of violence and lack of respect towards women. And by highlighting this today, I think we want to make sure that we look at where those drivers are for community attitudes and how we can provide the valuable evidence to inform the policy and practice that can deal with prevention of this violence. I think something we're all united in. Just one quick real-world example from my perspective on how these gendered norms affect so much of a part of our society and how that leads to a lack of respect and therefore violence towards women. I've experienced recently in chairing the more recent Women's Economic Equality Task Force, which recently reported to the Minister for Women. And what we discovered in there were deep and broad-ranging gender inequalities that underpin every woman's economic inequality. And of course, we noted that without a sense of safety and respect and a belief that violence is not part of your life, without that, there is no real clear path to economic equality. And just to give you some figures, on average, an Australian woman today earns about $1 million less than men across their life course. And if current working patterns continue with the gendered norms that are at the heart of our working and labour markets, the average 25-year-old woman today who has at least one child can expect to earn $2 million less over her lifetime than the average 25-year-old man who becomes a father. So wherever we look across the Australian economy and society, we see that gendered norms have an impact, and that's very much the case when we look at the norms that then lead to the statistics that we see across this sector and why today's discussion is so important. So I'd like to get straight into our guest speakers, and it is with great pleasure and wonderful that you could join us, Minister. I'd like to introduce the Honourable Justine Elliott, who is the Assistant Minister for Social Services and Assistant Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence, and she is the Federal Labor Member for Richmond. Just recently, Minister Elliott gave a speech highlighting the significant efforts of the Albanese government to address violence against women. And I just thought I'd highlight a couple of them before handing over to her. And these achievements include, really importantly, legislation for paid family and domestic violence leave, work underway on implementing all 55 recommendations of the Respect at Work report, reworking the escaping violence payment, which reduced the time it takes victim survivors to access support by 22 days. It's a very important intervention, and raising the age cutoff to parenting payment single back up from 8 to 14, which was a very important part of the May budget and spoke to the particular issues that affect single mothers in particular. And again, we know the interplay between that and the issues of violence against women. Minister Elliott, can I hand over to you and thank you for joining us and ask you just to maybe give us a few comments in relation to today's report.
Sure. Look, thank you so much, Sam, for that introduction. Can you hear me okay and see me okay with the sort of small technical issues I had? Wonderful. Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction. and particularly highlighting many of the recent announcements by the government. Can I also acknowledge the great work that you at ANROS do, and also to all the stakeholders here today. I really do want to acknowledge the outstanding work that you've all been doing. Before I get into a few remarks, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm coming to you from, and that's Bundjalung country here on the far north coast of New South Wales. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that acknowledgement and respect to all First Nations peoples joining us today. I would also like to acknowledge those with lived experience of domestic, family or sexual violence. Now, particularly thank you to ANROS for inviting me to launch this incredibly important body of work, the NCAS, or the 2021 National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women Survey Youth Report, and very importantly focusing on those views of younger people. And I thank you for all the work that's gone into this report. And as we all know, the prevalence of family, domestic and sexual violence in Australia is unacceptably high. And indeed, young women, of course, are a group who are at high risk, with many types of violence, including sexual assault and intimate partner violence, being experienced more commonly by young Australian women under 25 years of age. And these latest findings that we have from this report are so integral to the evidence base of our national plan to end violence against women and children. And the findings really help us to improve our understanding of what young people in Australia think about family, domestic and sexual violence, and really highlights those areas where more action is needed. It is encouraging to see significant improvements in young people's understanding of violence against women and attitudes towards gender inequality. And very positively, young people significantly increase their rejection of attitudes that mistrust women's reports of violence and those that objectify women and disregard consent. There was not, however, a similar improvement in their rejection of some previous gender bias and attitudes that minimise the seriousness of violence or blaming victim survivors. And 91% of young people also agreed that violence against women is a problem in Australia. And most young people did indicate they would intervene if they witnessed forms of disrespect, including verbal abuse, and that was 96% said that, or a boss telling or making a sexist joke, and indeed 63% indicated they would intervene in that case. It is telling, however, that the results show there are significant gender differences in understanding attitudes regarding violence against women and attitudes towards gender inequality. While 60% of young women correctly identified that men mainly commit domestic violence, only 48% of young men did. So clearly there is so much work that needs to be done in terms of raising awareness and understanding. And young men have such an important role to play in constructively engaging with and challenging views that condone gender inequality and gender-based violence. By engaging with men and boys in a way that really resonates with them, we can help encouraging them to play an important role in preventing violence in their families, their relationships, and across all settings in our communities. Now, as Sam mentioned at the beginning, women's safety is an absolute national priority for our government, the Albanese Labor government, and you've seen that through our various commitments that we have made. And the findings of this report today, the youth report, are consistent with the objectives outlined in our national plan, which emphasise the absolute importance of the initiatives in the plan right across prevention, early intervention, response and recovery and healing. And as part of our $2.3 billion investment in women's safety, there's already really crucial work underway to address the findings in this report. And this is quite a long list that I do want to run through because it is important in terms of the commitments that have been made to address many of these issues. So as part of that investment, there's $77.6 million to support schools in delivering high quality, age appropriate, evidence-based, respectful relationships education. There's $40 million to develop a new national prevention campaign on consent and respectful relationships. $35 million to implement recommendations from the Respect at Work report, $6.5 million to work with states and territories to strengthen and harmonise sexual assault and consent laws and improve criminal justice responses for victim survivors. And $3.5 million to help provide school-age boys with greater understanding of ways to have healthy relationships with masculinity. And $3.5 million to support teachers' consent to develop and distribute social media resources for young people aged 16 years. And the continuation of the very important Stop It at the Start campaign, which really aims to break the cycle of violence by encouraging adults to reflect on their attitudes and continue to have conversations about respect with young people. So we have made those commitments and we understand there is a lot more work to be done in this space as well. But the findings of this report show that young people are often open to change, which is a good sign, and it really presents us with the crucial and valuable opportunity to seize. Whilst there's more to be done, the report recognises the really important role of young people in achieving our shared goal of ending gender-based violence. But to change those behaviours, we have to understand what is driving them, and understanding how and why young people act is crucial, absolutely crucial to any big social changes. And the findings really reaffirm our continued investment in the area of primary prevention and the importance of always working with young people. If we engage with them, young people can be the catalyst of social change and to help shape our culture that rejects violence against women and really fosters gender equality. So with sustained efforts to reduce family, domestic and sexual violence, I hope, as I know all of you do, that future NCAST reports show continued improvements in understanding violence against women and attitudes rejecting gender inequality. And I really look forward to working with all of you in 2024 towards that really important goal. Now, particularly thank you again to Anne-Rose for having me here today. And I really look forward, as you do, to hearing, I think, next from Matt Cohn from YSF, who's going to speak more on the importance of the findings on this report. And thanks again, Sam, to you and Anne-Rose for this report. There's some very important findings for all of us. And if anything, it certainly does reaffirm our shared commitment to working together to ending violence against women and children in one generation. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you so much, Minister, and such a comprehensive sweep of both what we're all working towards and the commitments that have been made by your government and working alongside the sector in partnership. And so congratulations and thank you. And we're really delighted you could join us today to launch this part of the report. As you indicated, there is so much in this report that really is the voices of young people. And so we're delighted to actually be joined by a young person as part of the panel. I'm certainly a long way away from being young, so it's wonderful, Matt Cohn, to have you join us. And before I introduce Matt, I'll just indicate that we're running a little bit behind time. And I think what we might do, if you're happy as participants, if we can go to about 11:40, so we can hear from Matt and then hear from the team around the report itself, so that we're not pushing against time, if people are happy with that. Mac works with YFS, a youth family service in Queensland, in a program called R4 Respect. It's a primary prevention program for domestic and family violence, and it is run with young people in a number of schools and detention centres across southeast Queensland. R4 Respect focuses on the importance of consent and respect within relationships, and with a hope to empower young people to change the culture we live in and that we're hearing about through this survey. We actually did look at Anne-Rose, we did look in 2019 at the lessons from the R4 Respect project, and it showed that the program had a really positive impact on young people's understanding of the nature and extent of interpersonal violence. And I also want to highlight that the program effectively employs the evidence base, as we always hope, the evidence to action. And so, Mac, I'm going to hand to you to talk a little bit more about this from your perspective in the program. And I just wanted to acknowledge as well that in addition to everything else Mac's doing, he's also studying a Bachelor of Social Work. So over to you, Mac.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Before I jump into what I'll be talking about today, again, my name is Matt Cohn. I am 20 and I'm joining in from Yugambeh country, which is in the Logan area, 30 minutes south of Brisbane. Queensland. So yeah, I'm currently studying a Bachelor of Social Work and just about halfway through. I'm here on behalf of Art for Respect today, and we are a group of young people between the ages of 17 to 24 that run primary prevention programs for domestic violence out in schools and detention centres across southeast Queensland. So Art for Respect was started in 2015 by Youth Family Service, or more commonly known as YFS, when they saw a need for young people to learn about healthy relationships to eradicate domestic and family violence. Within our programs, we break down consent, domestic violence, sexual assault, and respectful relationships. And we use a peer-to-peer model with students, which looks like using a flat power structure when working alongside young people. We relate to young people because we are also young, still learning, and we believe that young people are agents of change, not agents to be changed. They are the ones who are going to change the culture that we see today. When looking at the 2021 NCAST report, the statistics are relatively similar to what we hear within our sessions with young people. More and more young people understand toxic relationships and starting to reject domestic and family violence, but there still is a fair way to go, with some young people still holding harmful views around women, thinking that women are untrustworthy and vengeful and most likely to make up being assaulted. We ask young people how many women they think may have been making up being sexually assaulted. And some young people come up with a statistic around 50%, some 70%, and the highest is that 98%. But when we break it to them that it's only 2%, there is a sense of shock in the room, with people realizing that their TikTok, that their Instagram or Snapchat feed may be sharing inaccurate information. We must acknowledge that young people have access to social media, as well as they are at a stage of crucial brain development where what they inhale will have an impact on them for years to come, which can have an impact on the way that young people perceive and perpetrate violence and abuse. With social media comes different echo chambers where people will express their views or interact with them. And the social media algorithm will draw in certain people depending on what someone searches up or interacts with. There's also something that we call the manosphere. This is where the manosphere comes in. And if you don't know what that is, don't stress. Essentially, it is a space for misogyny to stew. It gives space to speak freely about misogyny and not be called out for it. So among young men, there is manospheres popping up on both social media platforms and in physical groups that have an impact on the way that young men and women view violence. We often work with young men who have been influenced by the manosphere. As confronting as this may be, we try to create a safe space for these people to express their views while offering alternative views based on evidence and statistics. It is crucial that there is an understanding of the power balance within society. Young men don't understand the status they hold without even trying, and it's important to make young men aware of gender inequality and how that may impact not only them, but women as well. So when we were in our sessions, it is also crucial that young people are empowered with the information we give them. At Art for Respect, we emphasize that empowerment is greater than shame. With shame only does so much, but empowerment creates real change. So while we don't agree with some of the views we come across, we respect young people and their experience while challenging their toxic views and behaviours through conversation and sharing of statistics. Thank you, everyone. My name is Mac from Art for Respect.
Max, thank you for the work that you do and have done for a long time, but also for just that searing honesty at the heart of those few remarks. And I think just to acknowledge the manosphere and to acknowledge that we don't want a society that acts on or tells young people what to do, but stands alongside young people, learns from young people and understands what a young person's world is like today. And your description of how that's influenced by not just social media, but then the interaction that comes into the physical world. There was so much in that. It was a very short, pithy presentation, but thank you. And to hear a young man who's acting as you are with your colleagues and young men and women in your work is something that we hope we can continue to do, utilising the evidence base from this report. But thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all that you do. I hope that a world is defined by a young man like you as we think about the future for everyone, but particularly for women and girls that are so desperately affected by these misunderstandings about the perpetration of violence and poor attitudes. So with that, we've now come to the point that I think is really important in this discussion, which is to hear directly from Dr. Christine Koumalaris, who has been the Chief Researcher and Director of the NCAST Research Program. Christine joined ANROS. We've been so fortunate to have Christine as part of the senior team at ANROS with more than 25 years experience directing research programs in the area of crime and justice, as well as broader research into psychology and health. Christine's research and evaluation expertise includes major populations surveys and spans quantitative, qualitative and mixed methods approaches. This background has been exceptional for the work that Christine has done to deliver 2 waves of the NCAST. It's over a long period of time, and now working on the next wave that's yet to come. And I'm looking forward to, as we all are, to what we learn from the next NCAST. But we are looking at 2021. So, Christine, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through the high-level findings for our audience.
Thank you, Sam, and hello, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend my respects to all First Nations people who are joining us today. Okay, so a little bit about the NCAS. First of all, about the method. It's a representative population survey that is conducted every 4 years, and it measures the Australian community's understanding of violence against women and attitudes towards this violence and gender inequality. It's a key mechanism for measuring progress towards ending this violence and for informing policy and prevention. And it does this by identifying changes over time, as well as gaps in understanding and problematic attitudes that reflect the social culture that maintains violence against women. In 2021, we interviewed over 19,000 Australians, including over 1,600 young people aged 16 to 24 years. The NCAS asked 106 questions about understanding and attitudes, and these were grouped into the psychometric scales that you see there on the screen. The 3 main scales shown by the yellow boxes measure attitudes towards violence against women, understanding of this violence, and attitudes towards gender inequality. As you can see, each of these main scales comprises subscales that measure different aspects of the broader concepts. The items were also regrouped into type of violence scales, shown by the blue boxes, and that was to measure attitudes towards domestic, sexual and technology facilitated violence and abuse. First, let's look at some high-level results. So the good news is young people's understanding and attitudes have improved over time, and all the key scales indicate improvement in young people's understanding and attitudes since 2017, with only one exception, and that was the domestic violence scale. However, attitudes towards domestic violence have improved over the longer term. But attitudes move slowly and progress is slow. For young people, as for all Australians, there was a consistent gender gap across all measures, with men lagging behind. So compared to young women, young men had lower understanding of violence against women, including lower recognition of violent behaviours. They also had lower recognition of gender inequality, including lower rejection of attitudes that deny this inequality, that condone limiting women's autonomy, that normalise sexism, that reinforce rigid gender roles and that undermine women's leadership. And they also had lower rejection of violence against women, including lower rejection of attitudes that minimise this violence, that mistrust women's reports of violence, and that objectify women and disregard their consent. Now, since gender differences develop early, education and prevention initiatives also need to start early and continue through the formative years, and they need to work across genders, and particularly with boys and men. There were also age differences. Firstly, within the cohort of young people, 16 to 17-year-olds often had lower understanding of violence and lower rejection of problematic attitudes compared to young people aged 18 to 24 years. And comparing the whole group of young people to those over 24 years of age, we saw that young people had lower understanding of violence against women overall, but they did have higher understanding on some measures. They had similar rejection of problematic attitudes to those over 24 years of age. This last finding indicates that attitudes towards violence and gender inequality also develop early. Let's look a little closer now at young people's understanding of violence against women. Young people, like most age groups, had high recognition of the diverse behaviours constituting violence. However, like all age groups, young people had higher recognition of physical rather than non-physical forms of domestic violence, such as those on the screen, and they also had higher recognition of physical forms of domestic violence than of forms targeting a partner's identity or experience, such as targeting their disability, sexual orientation, religion and migrant status. So it's quite important that education increases the recognition of these non-physical forms of violence. This slide shows that all age groups could improve their understanding that domestic violence is mainly committed by men against women. And in addition, young people lagged behind other Australians here. So contrary to victimisation statistics from the Personal Safety Survey, we see here that 45% of young NCAS respondents incorrectly believed that women and men are equally likely to experience fear as a result of domestic violence. Only 25% of other respondents believe this. So these findings suggest that many young people and quite a few older Australians have a gender ignoring bias. We need to challenge this bias via education about the gender differences in norms, structures and systems that underpin gender-based violence. However, the good news was that young people also showed higher understanding compared to other Australians on some questions. Firstly, most young people recognise that violence against women is a problem in all communities. You can see here that 91% agreed that it's a problem in Australia, and although fewer young people, there was still a majority who agreed that it's a problem in their own suburb or town. And in fact, young people's recognition that violence is a problem in their own locality was higher than that of other respondents. So 53% of younger people recognised this, compared to 46% of other respondents. Identifying the reasons why some people better recognise that violence occurs everywhere, including close to home, could help inform the framing and focus of education and prevention initiatives. Secondly, more young people than older Australians knew how to access domestic violence services. You can see here that 64% of young people knew this, compared to 55% of those over 24 years of age. However, there's still room for improvement across all age groups. Let's look now at attitudes towards gender inequality. Young people, like other respondents, rejected many problematic attitudes that reinforce gender inequality. However, we saw with the NCAS results that they had higher recognition of some of these problematic attitudes than others. They had higher recognition of attitudes that reinforce rigid gender roles and stereotypes, but lower recognition of attitudes that condone limiting women's personal autonomy in relationships compared to some of the other attitudes towards gender inequality. So, therefore, challenging young people's acceptance of male power and intimate relationships and dating scripts is one area that warrants particular attention. Let's turn now to attitudes towards violence against women. Young people also rejected many of the attitudes that condone or reinforce this violence. But again, they had higher rejection in 2021 of some of these problematic attitudes. As you can see, they had higher rejection of attitudes that objectify women and disregard consent than both attitudes that minimise or excuse violence and attitudes that mistrust women's reports of violence. This difference wasn't one that was observed for all age groups. So this suggests that co-designing and prevention initiatives with young people, including co-designing initiatives with young victims and survivors, can help ensure that initiatives are tailored to their unique insights, their unique experiences and their specific needs. And it's also obviously important to strengthen attitudes that reject violence and that address myths and misconceptions that women are untrustworthy and vengeful. So consent, there was some good news about consent. Most young people recognised that consent must be active and ongoing. However, there's still room for improvement. As was the case for all ages, fewer young people disagreed that a man was justified in forcing sex when the woman, rather than the man, had initiated kissing. However, attitudes about sexual violence involving alcohol or drug use were complex. Results comparing young people with other respondents ran in both directions. The left-hand box shows that young people were more likely than older ages to excuse the perpetrator if he was under the influence of alcohol or drugs. But the right-hand box shows that young people were less likely than older ages to excuse the perpetrator if the victim was drunk. So it's really important that awareness-raising initiatives about ongoing consent are conducted across different contexts and they're needed across all age cohorts. Let's take a quick look now at bystander responses to witnessing abuse or disrespect of women. Good news, notably, most young people would be bothered by verbal abuse and sexist jokes, and most would intervene. However, the table shows that bystander responses are context specific. Firstly, they depended on the type of disrespect or abuse. So we see that more young people would be bothered and would intervene in response to verbal abuse than sexist jokes in the workplace. And secondly, the results showed that bystander responses are also affected by power differentials. Young people were least likely to intervene if a boss told a sexist joke. Many young people didn't feel comfortable speaking up here and feared there would be negative consequences of doing so. So it's really important to increase young people's knowledge, skills and confidence to act as pro-social bystanders. And it's also particularly important to remove barriers to speaking up, including barriers involving power dynamics in workplaces and other settings. I'll finish by just summarising some of the key messages from the NCAS results for young people. So firstly, it's clear that violence prevention initiatives should begin early and should continue through the formative years, given that gender differences emerge early and attitudes also develop early. Thus, primary prevention with young people is critical. It's also important to work across genders and particularly with boys and men to address gender differences. This should also include initiatives with perpetrators and early intervention initiatives. We could also strengthen co-design with young people, including young victims and survivors, to help ensure that prevention initiatives are tailored to their unique insights, experiences, stage of life and specific needs. In terms of understanding, it's also important to strengthen young people's recognition of non-physical forms of violence by reframing care and concern as abuse. We could also learn from and further strengthen young people's knowledge that violence occurs everywhere and their knowledge about accessing services. And we should challenge gender ignoring biases by highlighting pervasive gender differences in norms, structures, practices and systems. In terms of attitudes, we should adopt gender transformative approaches to break down rigid gender norms among young people and others. We could also challenge young people's acceptance of male power in intimate relationships and dating scripts. And education about the importance of active and ongoing consent is also critical. Further efforts are also needed to dispel myths and misconceptions that fuel mistrust of women's reports of victimisation. Finally, we need to increase young people's knowledge, skills and confidence to act as pro-social bystanders, and we should remove barriers to speaking up, including barriers involving power dynamics in workplaces and other settings. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your interest and your support today.
Thanks so much, Christine. I think we were wildly ambitious to think we could get through everything today in half an hour. So thank you for everybody staying online so that we could really get into the insights from the data. This once again goes to show that the work that NCAST does in the broader community of all of you, that turning the evidence into action, and how important it is for us to dissect all of our work and take down to certain cohorts and to learn about those specific issues around young people today, Christine. And the way you've been able to take us through a lot of complex pieces of information has been, I think, just really, really helpful and sets a scene for what we do next. And I think Matt gave us a really good example of why working with young people with the basis of this evidence is the way we'll be able to address these issues, and understanding the other factors that are at play for young people to make sure that the education and insights land well and are translated with and for young people in the way that Mac was able to show his work. And of course, with the Minister, the investments that are being made, the attention and focus that this issue is getting, and the fact that you're here today, Minister, looking specifically at the young people's issues within attitudes to within a broader set of community issues, I think has been really heartening. So on behalf of everyone who's joined us today, thank you to our special speakers. Christine, thank you for the work that goes into NCAS, and everyone involved and all of you online who play such an important part in this sector with the collaboration that's required to take this evidence into action. Thank you for joining. The report is, I think we've just put the QR code back up. It can be downloaded. We'll be doing much more on the insights, I'm sure, in the public domain through our communication at ANROS. But today, thank you all for joining. Please do have a restful time over the break ahead. Reflect and rest, because this will be the work of 2024 and beyond. And as the Minister said, we're committed to ending violence in a generation, and this is an important part of that commitment. Thank you, everybody, and I'll close our webinar for today. Thank you.